Okay, Wildcats. Today we're looking at Tuesday, January 22nd, complex numbers on page 29. If you would, update your table of contents. All right, now your table of contents are updated. Let's take a look at our notes. Imaginary numbers and complex numbers on page 29. An imaginary number is a number that is expressed in terms of the square root of a negative number. So I equals the square root of -1 is an imaginary number. Now, if we were to square both sides, we would get the square root of -1 squared, which is -1. So we can now say that I squared is -1. All right, complex number is a number that can be expressed in the form of a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers and I is the square root of -1. Every complex number has a real part a and an imaginary part b. So real part a plus imaginary part bi. If you would, finish up your notes. All right, now your notes are completed. Let's take a look at our examples, which are going to be on page 29. So the square root of -1 is I. The square root of -2 is the square root of 2I. The square root of -3 is the square root of 3I. Now, the square root of -4 is unique in that we can write this as the square root of 4 times the square root of -1. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of -1 is I, so we can say that the square root of -4 is 2I. The square root of -5 is the square root of 5I. The square root of -6 is the square root of 6I. The square root of -7 is the square root of 7I. The square root of -8 is the square root of 8I. The square root of -9 is unique in that the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of -1 is I, so the square root of -9 is 3I. Now, example 10, we're writing in the form of A plus BI. Well, the A is just a 2, plus the square root of -16 is 4I. Now, example 11, we would write it as -3 minus the square root of -17 is the square root of 17I. In example 11, this -4 plus the square root of -25 is 5I. Okay? All right, let's take a look at the next examples. All right, simplify each power of I. Now, the reason why I wrote I squared as -1 is because when we get to example 12 through 20, we need to use that concept, okay? Now, I to the first power is just I, okay? But I squared, we know from our notes, is -1. So we have to use the concept of I to the first power is I, and I squared is -1, and we're going to write each of those in that form. So I cubed can be written as I to the first power times I squared, because 1 plus 2 is 3. So we know that I squared is -1, and I to the first power is I, so that's just -I. Now here, I to the fourth power can be written as I squared times I squared, because 2 plus 2 is 4. So we know that that's -1 times -1, which is a +1. Now, I to the fifth power can be written as I squared times I squared times I. So I squared is -1, I squared is -1, and I to the first power is just I. So a negative times a negative is positive, times 1 is just 1I. Okay? So I to the sixth power can be written as I squared times I squared times I squared, because 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. So that's -1 times -1 times -1, which is a -1 times -1 is +1 times -1 is -1. Okay, I to the 7th power can be written as I squared times I squared times I squared times I to the 1st power. Well, that's -1 times -1 times -1 times I. Well, that's a +1 times a -1, which would be -1I. All right, example 18. That can be written as I squared times I squared times I squared times I squared. So 2, 4, 6, 8. So that's -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. -1 times -1 is +1 times -1 is -1 times -1 is +1. I to the 9th power can be written as I squared times I squared times I squared times I squared. So 2, 4, 6, 8 times I. So that's -1, -1, -1, -1, I. That becomes +1 times -1 is -1 times -1 is +1, so that's 1I. Okay, and then I to the 10th power is I squared times I squared times I squared times I squared, so 2, 4, 6, 8 I squared. So then that's -1 times -1 times -1 times -1. 1, 2, 3, there's 5 of them, -1. So -1 times -1 is +1 times -1 is -1. Becomes +1 here times negative, so that's -1. Okay, so that finishes up the examples. If you would, start working on your assignment and have a wonderful Wildcat